Howdy. Welcome to Ausgrave Royalty. I am Justin. We are continuing our series on Answer to Job and Archetype of the Apocalypse, and I say this all the time, but check out the previous episodes so you can get the full context of what the hell we're talking about, as well as the previous seasons on the channel. Speaking of context, I am not well versed in theology. As you can see from the title of the video, we're going to be talking about Revelation in the imagery in the Bible and all that, and how it relates to Archetype of the Apocalypse and what we've been talking about. But this is like my weakest area in this season. And again, I'm just average, whatever. I'm average dude, average intelligence, trying to understand all this like y'all. And this is, this particular area was challenging because it's not really where my interest is at primarily. I'm more interested in the Jungian psychological stuff, not the theological stuff, although it's related. So I kind of, have to restrain myself from checking out mentally when I start getting into the weeds. And Jung and Edinger definitely get into the weeds on a lot of the imagery and all that. So if you are interested in that, again, check out the texts themselves. And they have, what I'm sure is good analysis on some pretty nuanced imagery that is quite lost on me, frankly. Again, I could like go down that rabbit hole and learn all about the imagery and read Revelation word for word and all that, but it ironically it just doesn't call to me. I'm not like I haven't got that bug yet. Maybe someday, but not today. And I need to, I could do anything, but if I'm going to put together some kind of series and communicate something, I have to limit myself. So I'm limiting myself to what I find is most valuable and what's most interesting to me. So that's where I stand on all this. In any case, we can't not talk about it at all when it comes to these topics. So this is me trying to do my due diligence, and let's see, I'm looking at my notes here. Yeah, just to reiterate, what I know about the book of Revelation is just what I've learned in the three books we're looking at this season. Jung and Edinger have been my guides on this. I'm not playing jazz with any kind of knowledge. If I get something wrong, yeah, let me know in the comments. But yeah, so I'm new to this. I'm repeating myself, but go easy on me. Yeah, so why are we talking about the book of Revelation, and what does it have to do with the archetype of the apocalypse? And the better question would be, what doesn't it have to do with the apocalypse? And we talked last episode about the phenomenology of the archetype of the apocalypse, like what it feels like when you have an encounter with it. And it feels like the world is ending in a way, depending on how hard it's hitting you, how conscious you are of what's happening to you. And for all those details, check out that previous video. So think about what is in the book of Revelation. This is where the four horsemen come from, the Antichrist, the divine wrath, again, not seen since the Old Testament. Now there's the behemoth, the Leviathan, emerging from the abyss in the earth. And we'll talk about them briefly. But all of these, like imagery like this is dream imagery in general. It's coming from the collective unconscious, so the theory goes. And the way it communicates to us is through images, right? So think about the prophets of old and, being possessed by certain visions and stuff like that. Those are coming from, so the theory goes, this unconscious universe, and it's breaking through into an individual psyche and like possessing it. And this is why we talked about Answer to Job, that in a way an apocalypse is kind of a God possession. It's like God taking over your psyche if you're unconscious and putting you on autopilot in a certain way. And we talked about, in a certain way depending on all the different types of archetypes. It could be the magician, the warrior, the king, or the apocalypse here. So right, there's a question about the potency. And again, this applies to any archetype. And think of Icarus and Daedalus, right? Icarus flew too close to the sun and perished. And that's a great image for when archetypes can grant you so much power. Like the warrior archetype, right? Your work is piling up at work. Like tasks are piling up. The warrior archetype gives you is what gives you the energy to be able to tackle that, But if you fly too close to the sun, then that's where you get workaholism, where all of a sudden years have gone by and you're like, all I've been doing is working, And the tragedy is not realizing that ever until you're like, life has passed you by. And you thought, by accomplishing tasks, you were going to live a fulfilled life or something. And all the warrior archetype wants is just the next mission. Like, what's the next task? I will execute it. And they can't turn it off. And I talk about this in season 2 about regarding Warren Gillette's King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, that warriors often had to be separated from the rest of the tribe when they came back from like battle or something, because you have to decompress. Like think of Rambo, right? Think of the berserkers, like in Viking traditions, right? Like they psych themselves up, and what they're really doing is they're trying to let the warrior archetype. That's why they dance. Why, all that stuff. They psych themselves up, and that's a great turn of phrase. Psyche, right? So they're trying to summon that warrior mindset so that they can do the job they need to do, right? And people say archetypes are impractical, yet it's everywhere in every culture, manifesting in one way or the other, whether it be the workaholic or the Viking berserker. It's the same kind of thing. When it comes to the archetype of the apocalypse, as we hinted at last episode, you really want to microdose apocalypse, for lack of a better phrase. I think it's a good phrase. But, like, if you're biting your nails and then all of a sudden, oh, I bite my nails, I need to not do that. That's an apocalyptic event. But it's hilarious to say that because it's so small, right? But you became conscious of something you were doing unconsciously. What is individuation? Making the unconscious conscious. So you become more individuated in that micro little way. But if it's something very, like, a lot more potent, something really major, it can wreak all sorts of havoc. And we'll talk about a great case study of David Koresh in Waco in the next episode, I think. And that's what happens when the archetype of the apocalypse, when you get possessed by it. So imagine, like, apocalypse is change, right? It's when it's the moment the unconscious is becoming conscious. That moment of realization. It's like, oh, I am chronically unfaithful to every partner. Crap. I need, or whatever it might be, or I do drink too much, or whatever. Those, obviously, realizing that those moments can be shocking, and that's what Edinger said, and we walked through that last episode. And yeah, but Edinger is very optimistic that if we can just be, like, when a shock hits us, if we know what's happening to us, that we're being cooked, like, alchemically, that the unconscious is becoming conscious, and we have the free will to kind of engage with it or let it take us over. If enough of humanity can have enough awareness to be ready for events like that, to know what's happening to them, then he thinks the world will be okay. But if not, then then probably destruction is our fate, because unconsciousness typically leads to destruction. And that goes back to the Jungian quote, which I cite every episode, basically, which is, what we fail to make conscious will be acted out unconsciously in the outer world, and we will call it fate, right? So, let's see. Again, there's a biblical angle to Revelation that I'm not gonna go heavily into, but Edinger provides evidence for John the Baptist being the figure who received the book of the visions of the book of Revelation, who received the revelation, basically. He talks about Ezekiel too. And yeah, we'll get into that a little bit, but again, that's not the focus. So Jung, he says, he talks as if, and he's talking about John the Baptist. He talks as if he knew not only a sinless state, but also a perfect love, unlike Paul, who was not lacking in the necessary self-reflection. John is a bit too sure, and therefore he runs the risk of a dissociation. Under these circumstances, a counterposition is bound to grow up in the unconscious, which can then erupt into consciousness in the form of revelation. If this happens, the revelation will take the form of a more or less subjective myth because, among other things, it compensates the one-sidedness of an individual consciousness. So far as we can see, the apocalypse conforms to these conditions. That is a meteoric insight. I cannot stress enough. So we talked about the potency of an apocalypse, right? How the preference is that it's microdosed. But he's saying if you're too one-sided, like he's accusing John of, he's saying Paul was like, he had self-reflection, right? He had awareness, self-awareness. But John, he's saying, was a bit too pure, a bit too sure of himself. And so when you're a bit too one-sided, when you're basically not individuated, you run the risk of dissociation. It's kind of like a slingshot. And the more unconscious you are, aka the more one-sided, aka the more like purely instinctual you are, the shadow, it casts a longer shadow. And again, if the archetype of the apocalypse is referring to the moment the shadow becomes conscious, then if that slingshot is pulled back far enough, it can do serious damage when it when it breaks through to the conscious, right? And imagine, and this is what I think is it's pathological, where you're too extreme on one side and the other side breaks through, and when it does, you gain a pathology. You are like medically, archetypally possessed, for lack of a better term. And TLDR, we're talking about Koresh and Waco and all that. That's the theory. So it's that slingshot. Like, when the revelation comes, how pulled back is that slingshot, right? He says, the book of Jung, the book of Revelation is on the one hand so personal and on the other hand so archetypal and collective that one is obliged to consider both aspects. Our modern interest would certainly turn first to the person of John. Let us be psychologically correct, however. It is not the conscious mind of John that thinks up these fantasies. They come to him in a violent revelation. They fall upon him involuntarily with an unexpected vehemence and with an intensity which, as said, far transcends anything we could expect as compensation of a somewhat one-sided attitude of consciousness. But he must have had an intensive relationship to God, which lays him open to an invasion far transcending anything personal. The really religious person, in whom the capacity for an unusual extension of consciousness is inborn, must be prepared for such dangers. The purpose of the apocalyptic visions is not to tell John, as an ordinary human being, but how much shadow he hides beneath his luminous nature, but to open the seer's eye to the immensity of God. For he who loves God will know God. We can say that just because John loved God and did his best to love his fellows also, this gnosis, this knowledge of God, struck him. Like Job, he saw the fierce and terrible side of Yahweh. Excuse me. For this reason, he felt the gospel of love to be one-sided, and he supplemented it with the gospel of fear. God can be loved, but must be feared. That's a quote. Edinger says, we might see the text as a manifestation of the apocalypse archetype, which can express itself in the book of Revelation in different contexts that overlap and interpenetrate one another. The truly psychological strand is probably the most important category of all for our understanding of this text, namely, a symbolic expression of the coming of the self into conscious realization in an individual psyche. The book of Revelation is undoubtedly based on a personal visionary experience, but as I have indicated, it is just as obvious that the text, as we have it, has been influenced by other apocalyptic literature, frequently with direct quotations from that literature. The parallels with Ezekiel's visions are very striking. There are direct quotations from the book of from the book of Daniel. In addition, the scholar R.H. Charles has pointed out at least 20 parallels, if not actual quotations, from the non-canonical book of Enoch. It is evident that Revelation is a product of assimilation of one kind or another. Taken as a whole, Edinger says, the book of Revelation is a symbolic representation of an encounter with the activated collective unconscious, out of which comes a manifestation of the self, symbolized in the final chapter of the text by the New Jerusalem. "50 to 60% of the American population believe in the literal interpretation of the Bible, while the idea of the rapture is very widespread among mainstream fundamentalist churches. Such a state of mind is a dehumanizing inflation that seeks permanent release from egohood and materiality." This is Edinger speaking. To embrace such a literal eschatological fantasy means, in effect, that the individual has already been raptured, literally seized. These people, therefore, have abandoned allegiance to the human enterprise and abdicated commitment to the historical process. I think, Edinger says, the rapture refers to the, to the capacity to bear or endure great hardship and distress, provided one understands the circumstances to be meaningful, provided one sees the events one is suffering to be a part of a larger purposeful pattern with a goal. It does not put one in heavenly bliss, to be sure, but it does make the events bearable. Psychological experience bears out that way of thinking. It is, at any rate, a way to understand the rapture as a symbol. Continuing, he says, the imagery of invasion really applies only to those individuals whom there is a vast disparity between consciousness and the accumulated energies of the unconscious. A dissociated state which has which has built up such an intense polarization between these two psychic realms that this kind of imagery necessarily arises. And a civilization whose collective psyche has become thoroughly secularized, speaking psychologically, not religiously, that has lost all sense of connection to the transpersonal dimension of the psyche and of life, is also fertile ground for the eruption of the same images, since that is the state of our own civilization. That is an epic, epic passage right there. So not only did he reiterate what Jung said earlier, that when there's this polarization, the more the polarized an individual psyche, the more apocalyptic imagery is, the more potent the apocalyptic imagery is going to be. He's saying that kind of imagery necessarily arises. Of course it would. Apocalypse, like horrible apocalyptic images would arise to the psyche who is completely polarized like that. And Edinger is hinting at that our society is like polarized as well, in that we're too far secular. We're too secular. And this is what I talked about earlier, that people think, like, when they hear archetypes, right? They're like, archetypes aren't real, you know? What is that? The I Ching? Is that rune reading? Like, tea leaves? It's just like, they think it's some new age nonsense. Like, I say they, which is mainstream society. When people hear the word archetype, they're like, nonsense. It's why Jung is still, Jordan Peterson has brought him to the forefront. But aside from him, I still wouldn't call Jung mainstream by any means. People are very secular. Science rules everything. And that slingshot, Edinger is saying, is pulled back pretty far. And that's the danger of our civilization, he's saying. So, I want to speak on... So we talked a little bit about that. In the last few minutes, I want to talk about another image that occurs in Revelation. Of course, I'm not going to be able to cover everything in one video. Again, I already went over it in my introduction, but please do your own research. Don't take my word for anything. But one thing I found very interesting was the archetype of sacrifice and the lamb. And that appears in Revelation, that the lamb is a very powerful image. So Edinger says, this passage is indicating that sacrifice can generate huge power, because it is specifically power and glory that is imputed to the lamb from the fact that it was sacrificed. It bought its power with sacrificial blood. And that brings up the complex question of how we are to understand sacrifice psychologically. He, Jung, discusses what it means for an individual to sacrifice, for that person to give up something of value, to offer it as a gift. And he says such gifts always carry a personal claim with them. Excuse me. He continues, the only question is whether or not one is conscious of the claim. That makes all the difference. If we are conscious of our claim, then we can sacrifice it, for it is in our possession to begin with. But if a person is not conscious of the intent to receive something in return, it has not been owned and cannot be given up. Sacrifice, then, is a process that corresponds to the incarnation myth. It is a process that explains why the sacrificed lamb has so much power. The archetype of sacrifice, Edinger continues, of course, can also express itself in psychopathological form. It can be perverted. The so-called martyr complexes are an example of that. And it is not uncommon to see someone, quite often a woman, who presents herself as the suffering one, but with an iron fist just below the surface, with a claim that is totally unconscious to that person, but obvious to everybody else. Or there are cases where the living out of the martyr role has the effect not so much as a power motive against one's environment, but more inwardly against one's own developmental urge. Then the preservation of true sacrifice becomes a means of arresting one's own psychological development and keeping one from confronting ongoing life. And, as I read this, I think of a couple things. One, Ayn Rand had a lot to say about sacrifice as well. So I'd encourage y'all to check her out and research her thoughts on sacrifice. Her definition, I believe, if I recall, is that she looked down on sacrifice, to be clear. But let's state our definitions, right? What did she mean by it? She meant by sacrifice whenever you put a higher value in your life, when you supersede, when you take an action that puts a lower value over a higher value. That's what a sacrifice is to her. Like, you only have one dose of life-saving medicine, and you can either save your neighbor or you can save your wife or your own child, right? She's saying a sacrifice, assuming that you hold your significant other higher than a random person. She's saying it would be a sacrifice if you said, no, I can't be selfish, so I'm going to help the neighbor instead, That would be a sacrifice, which is not good for Ayn Rand. So this is, I like thinking about this, and I like the term archetype of sacrifice, because as we've covered, like, archetypes are fundamentally paradigmatic, classic human experiences, and most of us know what it is to feel sacrificing something. Yeah. Anyway, hope you all got something out of it. Again, look up Revelation and all this for further study, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.